And I'm going to start off by saying a couple little opening prayers. So I hope this isn't awkward for anyone. This is some traditional Buddhist stuff here. Just a little supplication prayer to the Buddha and to our lineage teachers. Ganshi tuji nyezone tawa tamje pambichur dambe chune donze bogo tamde la chaza lo kunzan dorzem garib shurizem pemakara jepani shima soso nunya tetin chaza so kater lama namla sowa de ne lo topa che or chinji lo ganri to karan chinji begu yonten kunjanga we jeza do nyimo donze bebe nyaja bo kunjin jugi jabo la sowa de jeja kunjin rola jeze ter trime waso yangro tu terzo uso longjen nangke nyaja bo jimi limbe shabla sowa de ritan Pruton Jabo Jeno Jinam Le Gombe Londe Bobe Terjidro, Lundo Juzu Janson Gawanjo, Mipon Jambe Yanla Soa, the Omenchuji Yingi Poton, and do some Shandi Kungi Ngoni. Ranzan Chukungon Donde Betawe Lame Jabla Soa, the Nelo Doba Jora Jinjilo, Dazo, Drowe Lona Chula, Jor Deshe. Gaje Donzan Dick, Donzan Kuni Jikdina, Deshe Lomar Jova Gang, Zida Dimber Dundir. Tinger dambe chuji jabna nimbar de bata da dershi lai ke tan lu tan chin ke dron da da mi ke nam ge dro kun ge dra ke jin ye pa tham che ke do da gi chu den do. All right, so now we're going to get started, and the topic this evening is the preliminary practices of Ngöndro. And, obviously, I don't want to assume too much of anyone, but the Ngöndro practices are a fundamental or first step kind of in the realm of Tantric Buddhism. And so I want to start a little bit by saying what this talk is going to be and what it's not going to be. This is not a full explanation of all the innermost secrets of Tantric Buddhism whatsoever, not at all. So I'm sorry if you got baited by the title. It is, however, going to be discussing through the Namchak Foundation and through AWAM, our sister organization. If you want to get into the traditional Namchak teachings, the way that you would do that, I'm going to talk about the curriculum and how that would go about, but I'm also just going to talk about what Ngöndro is and how you might decide if you want to do that, if that is the path for you. So Ngöndro just means preliminaries, so I'm not going to keep using a Tibetan word because that's just alienating for a lot of people. So I'm just going to call it the preliminaries from here on out. And so because this is an aspect of Tantric Buddhism, and Tantric Buddhism is a subsect or a set of methods or a special path of Mahayana Buddhism, I'm going to ask all of you to generate a particular type of motivation for listening to these teachings tonight. And if you're here just as a casual listener, you don't have to participate in this, but I assume there are a lot of you who maybe will want to. So the kind of attitude is what we call bodhicitta, or the mind of enlightenment. So if you want to just think in this way, that I'm going to listen to these teachings and put them into practice in order to bring all beings to the state of Buddhahood beyond all suffering. So that is my motivation for being here and sharing this with you. And if you care to, maybe make that your motivation for listening. If not, if your motivation is just to find out what's Namchak all about, what's this preliminary practice or Ngöndro all about, that's fine too. You don't have to participate on that level whatsoever, but I invite you to if you want to. And so the preliminary practices in the Namchak lineage, they are, first question that you might ask is preliminaries to what? And generally speaking, we would say the preliminaries to Tantric Buddhism, but more specifically, almost every Ngöndro or preliminary practices, set of practices in the Nyingma or early translation school lineage are technically preliminaries for Dzogchen. And Dzogchen is, I'm not going to get into too much detail or talk about that too much, but it is what we would say is the highest level of Tantric Buddhism within the Nyingma tradition. And therefore, there are certain things that traditionally you would want to do before you would go straight into that, which is kind of the highest level of view, meditation, and conduct within our entire tradition. There are certain things that you would want to do to prepare yourself. And they're not just things to get out of the way. They're things that are going to make your mind more ready or more refined to the point that those practices and those kind of levels of teaching or that kind of state of mind that's being described in those practices is even relevant to your experience. And what I mean by that is on all of these levels of practice, you could say within the Nyingma tradition, we talk about something called the 9 yanas or the 9 levels or 9 spiritual approaches. And from one perspective, you could say that those are refining your mind to a more and more and more and more subtle level. And if the level of this highly refined, highly subtle level of mind that's being described in the very highest level of teachings is something that you're getting an explanation on, but your mind's level is actually still very coarse and has not been trained or refined to a level where you can even really, on a tangible level, of course, maybe intellectually you can understand what that means, but it's only intellectual. That's the situation that many people find themselves in. A lot of people, these days, the word Dzogchen, the great perfection, is very famous. Everyone knows that word. If they've studied about Tibetan Buddhism, or especially the Nyingma tradition, they've heard that word and they know that that's the high thing and they want to get there. And it becomes like a race to the highest or the best. And everyone wants the highest or the best. So I don't blame anyone for that, of course. But I can say from my own experience and from my own experience as especially an interpreter, a little bit as a teacher, more as an interpreter, because I've interpreted for a number of really wonderful teachers who have spent significantly more time of their lives in study and practice and been their interpreter for so many interviews with so many people. And, there is a certain saying that they say that you're Dzogchen in word, but not Dzogchen in the level of your mind. And so these practices are kind of a way of making sure that you're actually going to make good use of those teachings, that they're even going to be relevant to you, that the power that is praised and talked about in all of these teachings is actually like what you're going to get from that, because if you, I don't want to harp on this too much, but the idea of the preliminaries is to get you to a place where that teaching is going to be as powerful as all the texts praise it to be, and so they talk about the great perfection teachings as being teachings that can bring you to the state of enlightenment in one lifetime. And you'll hear things about the rainbow body and enlightenment in just a few months and all these kind of things, like really radical ideas that you'll hear about in the Nyingma school and particularly in the Dzogchen. You might read some biographies of Dzogchen masters or praises to this and that master, praises to this and that text or this and that technique. And that Dharma can be that precious. It can be that quick. It can be that effective to the right person, okay? And that doesn't mean that anyone can't be the right person if they do the work. And so that's why we have preliminaries. And so let me come around now to what the preliminaries are instead of talking about Dzogchen stuff. I'm not planning on talking anymore about the details of that anyway. I don't feel like it's a really appropriate topic to talk about on the internet for myself. Some teachers may feel it's appropriate for them, but for myself, it's absolutely not my place. So we're going to talk about the preliminaries themselves. And so these are, generally speaking, 5 practices which will do a few different things to your mind or your experience. And I'll talk about this in more detail one by one, but Namchak Khen Rinpoche, who is one of my closest teachers and one of the main teachers of the Namchak Foundation and of AWAM International, he is Gochen Trukul Sangha Rinpoche's younger brother, and he's the teacher who I work with the most as an interpreter and as a student myself. And every time he teaches the Ngöndro, he really talks about how these practices are working on your mind to develop 3 main qualities. And those are a genuine wish for liberation, which you might sometimes call renunciation. The second is the mind of bodhicitta, so the wish to free all beings from suffering and bring them to enlightenment. And third, pure view. We'll talk about those individually as we go through some of the practices, but initially, the first practices that we're going to work with in the preliminaries are something that's called the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. And these are practices which are essentially, I'll get into a little more detail, but they are helping you to change your general perspective from one of only wishing for happiness for yourself, kind of in this life or potentially even in future lives, and shifting that focus to one that wishes for liberation. And so that begs the question, liberation from what? And what's wrong with happiness and all of that. I might talk about that a little bit, but I'm going to have to make certain assumptions about that. Some of you have a basic level of education about Buddhism, or else I'll have to end up talking only about what is samsara, what is liberation, and all of that, and then all of our time will be gone. So I just have to assume that there is a basic understanding of that there is this cycle that we call samsara. Within that, we could say that the unenlightened existence, you're unenlightened, all of your perceptions and the cycle of life that you live in, whether you're thinking of it in this one lifetime or a sequence of lifetimes, all of this that we could call an unenlightened experience is all contained within or could be talked about as some kind of suffering or dissatisfaction. That no matter what, even if you think there's some kind of immediate sense of happiness, that even that only exists in comparison to something worse, or it is only feeling happy at the alleviation or the elimination of some kind of difficulty. Or that our current experience is one, even if it feels happy, it's not going to stick around, that we're going to slip into suffering. Or that everything that we do right now, because we're unenlightened and we think that everything is real as it appears to us, is continuing a habitual pattern of karmic patterning, which is going to keep us in this cycle onward into the future until we do something about it to challenge that general kind of assumption that everything's real. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And so we'll just say that the first practice of the four thoughts is one that is helping you to wish to be free from that cycle. And so the first of those four thoughts is the preciousness of the human rebirth, or the precious human rebirth, I should say, because it's not as if in these teachings, it's not as if all human experience is considered precious. Precious is defined specifically by, in the text, 18 features. And I could just rattle those off really quickly. I don't know how helpful that is to just list off numbers at this point. I can send you to some texts that you can read if you want to follow up on this. But essentially, the point is that you all, myself included, we all have been born into a situation where we have the freedom to practice the Dharma if we want to. We live in a place where the Dharma even exists in the first place. Like a Buddha came to this world, his teachings are still around, people are still engaging with them, so we can find teachers and a lineage to connect with. All these kind of things are still in place. We have the faculties, like the mental faculties, the sharpness and so forth, that allow us to think about those teachings and decide if we want to engage in them. All of these kind of things. We have access to a teacher who can actually help us along that path. And so the first practice is to contemplate these things and decide, or kind of come to the understanding that this is actually a really precious experience. And even that within the human realm, there are a lot of people who don't have this opportunity, who never met with the Buddhist teachings, or potentially were born in a situation where they considered the Buddhist teachings, some kind of awful, devil worship kind of thing. I don't know. There are a lot of places in the world like that, other religions that you could have been born into, or outlooks that you could have been born into, and so forth. It has you contemplate all the different realms, and how in all these different realms of existence, like had you been born an animal, that you wouldn't have the potential to practice the Dharma. Had you been born in a situation of being in a so-called God state, we're not going to get into what that might mean in Buddhism. That's a whole nother discussion, but that you wouldn't have the potential to practice the Dharma, and so forth. If you were born in a realm of terrible suffering, where all you could think about is suffering and your experience of suffering, you wouldn't have the freedom to practice. And so contemplating all of these situations, kind of what it would have been like to not have the opportunity or freedom or potential in terms of your intellect or your physical situation, then you realize, or you will hopefully come to realize, the idea is that you may come to realize that this situation is one that's very precious, that it's not just a given that you would have this opportunity. Then the second of those contemplations is of death and impermanence. So it's like, okay, we've got this great opportunity, but we could die at any time. So we do all these contemplations about impermanence in general as a general principle, as well as the impermanence of our own potential death, that the causes of death are many, the causes of living are few, that death could happen at any time. So like death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain. And then meditating on impermanence in general, in the course level impermanence, which means that we were born and at a certain point we will die. the seasons change and so forth. But then on the more subtle level of impermanence, that, even though, yes, at a certain point we're born, at a certain point we die, for every tiny moment in between those two, we're constantly changing. We're never the same for a single moment. That even if you look at the four changes on a more obvious level, yeah, there's the impermanence that summer turns into fall, fall turns into winter, winter into spring, and so forth. But on a more subtle level, there's never a single moment where fall is just stuck. It's just constantly changing. Like the leaves are constantly changing, growing, drying, and so forth, eventually falling. That there's never a single instant where anything is stagnant. And so that's a subtle impermanence. So you go through all these kind of contemplations. Hundreds of years ago, in the place where you are right now, potentially there was another whole civilization there that has since been destroyed, and now you're in the city there. Or potentially you live on a farm, and you think of all the people who lived in that farm and all the generations of people who died in that same place before you. In a single instant in this world, how many people are being born? How many people are dying? So there's a lot of contemplations, and particularly if you want to go through the full breadth of all of those, I would suggest that you read a book called The Words of My Perfect Teacher, which goes through many different outline points of all the different contemplations of these four thoughts. I mean, it goes through all of the preliminary practices, but particularly of the four thoughts, just in terms of our current discussion. And so when we talk about turning the mind, it's said that those first two of the four thoughts, the prescience of human rebirth and death and impermanence, help you to turn your fixations away from merely wanting to become happy in this lifetime. Because if you realize that you have a precious opportunity, but you could lose it anytime, you'll be more likely to want to work towards what's most meaningful, which in this context would be striving for liberation and not merely trying to be caught up in all the distractions of temporary pleasure, things like that. Then the second two of these are the sufferings of samsara and karmic causes and results. So these two can be practiced together. So often they're explained separately, but in our tradition, especially with Namchak Khen Rinpoche's explanations and Tulku Sangha Rinpoche's explanations, we usually meditate on them together. So basically what that is saying is that if you understand the karmic process, then you understand how certain kinds of patterns of behavior and thought lead you to experience things in a certain way, lead to your experience of certain things as pleasurable or displeasurable, lead you to continue ending up in the same kind of circumstances that you're creating for yourself and so forth. So when you then meditate on the sufferings of samsara, all these different realms of experience, like we'll just talk about the human realm right now, but in general, they talk about all the different realms of each and every one of those realms of experience. And then they talk about in the sufferings of samsara, they just describe the sufferings. In the karmic section, they talk about the causes that would have led you to end up in that situation. And so when you're doing the meditations, if you're meditating on karma, you can think about, okay, if I were to keep indulging in this type of thought pattern or this type of activity, it may lead me in the future to have an experience similar to this and that type of realm. Or if you're contemplating the sufferings of those realms, then you think back as you're contemplating the suffering of that realm, what caused that? And as you do that, you start to understand that everything in the entire world of samsara, even in the human realm, so I'll talk a little bit about the suffering of the human realm in a second, is still within the cycle of this suffering. And that everything that we're doing in our ordinary unenlightened kind of day-to-day way of thinking and interacting with the world is still creating causes which are going to continue the cycle of suffering. And so this brings in what I'm about to say, brings in that a lot of these teachings are taught to an audience who already fully accept that the existence of past and future lives. So I just want to put that out there real quick before I start continuing in this way. And I'll try and frame things in a way that you may be able to understand without 100% conviction in that, but just so you know that this whole conversation is happening kind of within that framework. And so they would say that a lot of practitioners in maybe traditional countries where that is the assumption that there are past and future lives, might think, okay, well, I just want to be a good person. I want to be virtuous. Maybe I'll meditate a little bit just so in my future life, I can be born again as a human or in a God realm or something like that. I don't want to fall down and become an animal or go to hell or something like that. So it's only for that reason that I'm going to do something virtuous. And so they say that the second two of the four thoughts, so the first two, like I said before, are to help you to overcome your fixations on the temporary kind of pleasures or distractions of this lifetime. And the second two are to prevent you from thinking, oh, well, maybe I still want to strive and I don't want to waste this lifetime, but I'm going to strive just to get a better situation in samsara. So those second two are to kind of show or to kind of hopefully convince you that even if you make it into a better realm of samsara, it's still within the realm of suffering, and you're still going to be continuing creating this cycle of suffering, which keeps you trapped in the cycle of samsara. So it's kind of to help you to overcome even wishing for a better situation in a future life, and to ultimately want you to escape from samsara entirely. And so when I say escape from samsara, this is Buddhist jargon. It doesn't mean run away from home or stop being friends with people that you love or kill yourself or do, it's not an erasure of your existence or a separation of yourself from the world necessarily. It's a perception thing. So anyway, I think that some people get the idea that when we say liberate from samsara, or this is samsara, you guys are in samsara, I'm like a spiritual person, so that's not what it is. A lot of people get into some weird head games, like some weird thought patterns of thinking that, I don't know, like people get onto this spiritual trip where they think that because they're a practitioner or something, that somehow like other people are in samsara, but it's a really dangerous, slippery slope. You create your own very special, very self-deceptive samsara through a spiritual path. It's very possible if you're not careful. And so those four thoughts then are basically the idea of those four thoughts and those contemplations is to gain a sense of or a genuine wish for liberation. So the next, what we would call the main practices. So those first four are what we call the common outer preliminaries. And so they're common because they're not specific to Mahayana Buddhism or Tantric Buddhism. They're something that's in common with all Buddhist traditions, all Buddhist paths, meaning like Theravada Buddhism and so forth. So then when we move into the next section, so the uncommon inner preliminaries are taking refuge, generating bodhicitta, vajrasattva, we call it vajrasattva meditation and recitation of the mantra, mandala offering, and guru yoga. And in some preliminary practices, together with the mandala offering, there's also a short chud practice, which is like a offering practice where you kind of imagine offering your body. That's in the Longchen practice, and I'm not 100% sure other ones. That's the one that I've practiced before that has that in it, but the Namchak tradition does not have that additional chud practice. So all four of these five of these have a specific purpose. So refuge is said to be setting the foundation for any other Buddhist practice that you would ever do, because the essence of refuge is kind of a commitment and a trust in the Buddhist path. You could say in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, or once you get into the preliminaries, once you're into this world of Ngöndro, there's a more profound even understanding of what Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha even mean. So on some level, it's the guy who attained enlightenment 2,600 years ago in Bihar, India. And the Sangha, in some level, is like the people who have continued that tradition ever since. And the Dharma is some stuff that he said and now is contained in books and is being translated and that you can read on the internet or buy a book of or hear someone talk about. But there is a deeper understanding to what that means once you get into these kind of practices. So I'm just going to give, as I go through and I say these things exist, I'll give you a little taste of what that is, but I'm not going to explain it until you decide that you want to do it. Then you'll get the full explanations later. But on a certain level, a lot of this stuff about Vajrayana Buddhism and about the preliminaries is based on an idea which is maybe shared in the Sutra tradition, but more elaborated upon and focused upon in the Tantric tradition, which is Buddha nature. And so Buddha nature gets different names when you're talking about it in Tantra. Usually the word Buddha nature is a sutra type of word. It's used in more Mahayana sutras and texts of that nature. But it's kind of the fundamental like basis from which you would talk about Tantric Buddhism. And essentially what that's talking about is that it says, according to those teachings, that we're all already enlightened in the nature of our being, in the actual kind of ground of our being. Our essence is already pure. We already have all of the qualities of Buddhahood fully intact, not needing to be developed, already fully intact within us, but they're obscured by all of our previous negative actions and obscurations of dualistic thought, afflictive emotions, and so forth. So they give often an example of the sun and the clouds, that the sun is always shining just as bright, whether there are clouds there or not. The sun didn't get less intense because there was a cloud there. You just didn't see the power of the sun because the clouds were blocking it. And in the same way, according to this kind of level of approach to teachings or level of approach to Buddhism, your Buddha qualities are already fully present within you. And the practice of the path is not to create Buddhahood, but to kind of unveil what's already there. So from one perspective, the word Tantra in some explanations means continuum or continuity, which means that your nature that you're going to reveal as a Buddha is the same nature that you already started with as your working basis. And then as you're practicing, you're trying to practice something that's kind of similar to that fully ripened result by visualizing yourself as deities and working with an approximation of a meditation of emptiness in the nature of your mind and things like that. So you already are enlightened. In the middle, you kind of pretend you're enlightened, and that helps you to unveil that enlightenment that was always the case. So that's that continuum or continuity. And so that's kind of the perspective that all of this is happening within once you get into the inner uncommon preliminaries from refuge onward. So the reason I brought that up is that once you're practicing refuge, yes, there is this idea of the Buddha who was alive 2,600 years ago. There's also an idea of working with kind of sometimes you would use the word like archetypes, like sometimes Lama Tsomo, who's another one of our teachers and the director of the Namchak Foundation, will use the word archetypes. But another way to think of it is that, yeah, I'll just stick with that word archetype for now. It's a way that we can, as an unenlightened person, try to connect with the energy of enlightenment. So in the refuge practice, you're kind of looking at some kind of idealized form of a Buddha, and you imagine them in the space in front of you. And on some level, you imagine that they are the embodiment of all enlightened beings in the world. And you're kind of taking refuge to them. And then in some preliminary practices, they talk about, okay, I'm taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but I'm also taking refuge in the nature of my own mind. So there are different levels of refuge, but essentially the idea of refuge is to gain some kind of a conviction or a trust in, for one, the path to enlightenment, like that the Buddha was enlightened, that his Dharma will help you get enlightened, and that there is this Sangha that will help support you on your path to enlightenment. From another level, it's trying to kind of help you gain conviction in your own kind of innate purity, in the innate Buddhahood of yourself. And so often on the most outer level of refuge discussion, we say that you take refuge in the Buddha as the teacher, the Dharma as the path, and the Sangha as the community of helpers. And on the most common or outer level, that is the way we take refuge. And for beginners, even in the preliminaries, that's the best way to continue thinking about it, because that's the most relevant. Like at the very beginning, it's an idea, it's an aspiration to like fully trust in your innate enlightenment. But for a lot of people, it's just like, it's some good news that sounds nice, but they don't have a lot of deep conviction in it. But what you can more easily start to get some deep conviction in through reading books, through starting the practices and seeing some results for yourself, through meeting other teachers and so forth that seem to show some kind of qualities of compassion and wisdom and so forth that it seems like this path is working, through reading biographies of previous masters and so forth, you can start to gain conviction that this is a path that you might want to follow. And so that's kind of, trust or conviction is kind of one of the first ways that we work with refuge. And another interesting thing about the preliminaries is that they start to introduce a lot of really, really high kind of language from the very beginning, but most of the teachers won't explain to you in detail what that means yet. It just becomes like beautiful things to recite at first. And gradually, as you keep practicing, as you start to unveil some things for yourself, as you start to go deeper into the practices, then those words become more and more and more and more meaningful. So that's another interesting thing. For those of you who have never seen a text of the preliminary practices, you're going to start seeing, or if and when you ever do decide to do these practices, you'll start reading this stuff. And at first it might be like, this is like some kind of fancy, poetic, very like deep philosophical stuff. It's not just taking refuge in a person and a community of people and some teachings. There's something much more deep and profound behind that. So for now, I'm just going to leave that there and move on to the bodhicitta. And so then the second of the inner uncommon preliminaries is bodhicitta. And so we say that bodhicitta is the heart of the Mahayana path. Without bodhicitta, any practice that you do is not a Mahayana practice. So bodhicitta is that intention to free all beings from suffering and bring them to enlightenment. So even if you claim to be doing some highest yoga tantra or dzogchen or like inner yogas or all this stuff, but you're doing it only with a selfish intention, then it's not even Mahayana practice. It's just a selfish practice. And it will not lead you to the state of enlightenment. I guess that sounds like a very blanket statement, but that is, it comes from all kinds of authoritative texts, that the bodhicitta is the primary cause of enlightenment. As long as there is still a little sliver of selfishness, then that is the obscuration to complete enlightenment. So in that practice of bodhicitta, you usually recite some prayers, but then you also do a lot of mind training practices of the practice called tonglen, of giving and taking. So you're imagining kind of giving all of your goodness and virtue and good karma and so forth, and kind of imagining giving that out to all sentient beings, imagining that they receive it, and then taking on all of their bad karma, negative feelings, suffering, depression, and imagining that it comes within you and you kind of take that on for them. And other practices like the 4 immeasurables or the 4 boundless thoughts. So you're imagining, for example, like in boundless love, you imagine all sentient beings who lack love, and you wish for them to have love. You wish for them to have happiness. All beings who are, lacking happiness and the causes of happiness, you wish them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. For compassion, you imagine all beings who are currently suffering in any way, and you imagine, or you pray for them, you wish for them to have happiness, to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, so on and so forth. So part of the practice is some recitation of kind of a prayer of sorts, which is, in a certain sense, bodhicitta is a commitment towards this path of freeing beings and attaining enlightenment. So they often say that to be bodhicitta, it has to have 2 aspects. There is compassion focused on sentient beings and wisdom focused on enlightenment. So a lot of people say bodhicitta, but they're actually just talking about compassion. Or if someone asks them, what's bodhicitta? They just start talking about compassion. But mere compassion, meaning the wish for beings to be free from suffering, is not yet bodhicitta, because bodhicitta has to be the wish to free beings from suffering and the wish to bring them to the complete state of enlightenment. So that's the difference between bodhicitta and compassion. Sorry if that just seems like some silly distinction, but it is actually important in the tradition. So then the next practice is the first one that might seem a little bit more like what you think of as, if you have heard or read more about Tantric Buddhism, what you might think of as more like Tantric Buddhism, which is the Vajrasattva practice, where you're visualizing something that doesn't just like a person, it's like some kind of deity, and maybe even visualizing yourself in that enlightened form, that kind of divine form. So this practice is said to be the purpose of this is to purify your obscurations and purify your negative karma. And in some practices of this, in certain traditions, you're imagining that Vajrasattva is above you and you're just an ordinary person. And that through the recitation of the mantra, combined with 4 particular ways of thinking, there's something called the 4 powers, that this kind of nectar of purification comes into you and then purifies your different, in some practices it's more or less elaborate. Sometimes it just fills you up with like this pure kind of wisdom, and you might imagine that all of your obscurations and things are coming out of your body in different ways. Different texts describe this differently. In some, there's more elaborate descriptions that it goes through your 4 chakras and all this kind of stuff and purifies you in different ways. In some of the practices in the Namchak tradition, instead of that, just from the very beginning, you are Vajrasattva. So in the Longqing Nyingtik tradition, the heart essence of the vast expanse, you're ordinary in ordinary form, just as you are. Vajrasattva is above you. After Vajrasattva purifies you, at the end, he dissolves into you, and then you become Vajrasattva at the end. In the Namchak tradition, you're just Vajrasattva from the very beginning. So there's a little bit of a distinction there, and different traditions do it in different ways. But anyway, just to get back to the purpose of Vajrasattva is to purify obscurations. So essentially, the 2 kind of purposes, like I said before, if you're talking about Buddha nature as something that's already there but obscured, then you have to clear away the filth to get to what's there. So Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, who he has a really great book on the preliminaries also called Not for Happiness. And in that book, he often uses the example of washing dishes for talking about Buddha nature and clearing obscurations. So he says that cleaning the dishes, washing a bowl, is kind of like similar to acknowledging your Buddha nature. I know this sounds silly at first, but if you didn't know the bowl was inherently pure white, whatever the material of the plate is, plastic or whatever, you wouldn't bother washing it. So if you thought that the stains on the plate were inherent to the plate and unwashable, you wouldn't even start washing. So in the same way, one of the parts of this practice is acknowledging that there's something there pure within you, and that the temporary stains, like your afflictive emotions and your ignorance, are not inherent to that pure nature. And then the whole practice after that is just cleaning, getting back to, and acknowledging that there's something there that's worth getting at. So I think that's a really great example. I don't know if that makes sense to you. If not, we can talk about it later. So anyway, the practice of Vajrasattva is, you could think of that as washing the dishes. And, maybe refuge, in the terms of refuge, it's kind of acknowledging on a certain level that the dish is worthy of cleaning in the first place, and that you have that dish, something like that. Okay. And then, do we have until 7 and then we break? Or 6:30? 6:30, 6:40. Okay. So I don't have a ton of time, so I can't harp on about each one of these too much. So the next one is the mandala offering. And I have left out some overarching, thing about this, but I'll come to it when we come to Guru Yoga, because that's going to kind of wrap up the whole picture here. So in mandala offering, they say that the purpose of this is gathering the accumulations. And that's a very Buddhist jargon word. That's a word that probably means nothing to half of you, unless you're already very steeped in like the world of Buddhist literature. Essentially, they say that to become a Buddha, there are 2 things you have to do. One is you have to gather virtue. You have to gather merit. And what that means to gather merit is you got to do a lot of good stuff. And by doing good stuff, you're creating really supportive circumstances for you to be a successful practitioner. For example, if you're doing a lot of bad stuff, speaking ill of others, creating disharmony, you are constantly giving way to all of your negative thinking, then you are setting yourself up in a situation where it's going to be really hard to make any practice in your spiritual life. If, on the other hand, you're kind to others, you're honest, you're generous, you are not doing a lot of things that leave you in a state of like worry and regret and so forth, you're going to have a much more open and expansive kind of mental state, a much more generally being at ease, because you know you're not hurting anyone, you know you're not creating a lot of disharmony and a lot of problems. Also, you're going to have more people that are going to want to support you. And so that's kind of what you can think of as merit and the accumulation of merit on one level. That's a simplified version, but I think that's, like, for our purposes, good enough for now. The second accumulation is the accumulation of wisdom, which means on one level, this is a tricky thing when you talk about Buddha nature, you can think about getting smarter. You learn more about the nature of your mind, the nature of reality, the nature of emptiness, something like that. From another perspective, when you're talking about Buddha nature, you can talk about realization and removing of obscurations. They're almost the same thing. So it's like, from one perspective, you say you knew something new. Another perspective, say you reveal a wisdom that was already there. So it's kind of paradoxical on that level when you're talking in Tantric Buddhism. So I'm not going to go into that topic too much, but anyway, the point is that by making the mandala offering, it said that you are generating a lot of merit. So basically what you're doing, I just said mandala offering. I didn't even explain what it is. I just started talking about accumulation. Sorry about that. So the mandala offering is a practice where you're basically imagining giving the entire world on different levels, on a more obvious outer level and maybe on a more inner, even a more pure level, on different levels, to the Buddhas, if you want to talk about that way. On another level, you're imagining that this being who you're giving it to, from one perspective, is your teacher. On another level is the embodiment of all enlightened beings. So you're generating kind of, they sometimes talk about it like you can't do business until you have generated some capital. They use these kind of explanations in Dharma texts, actually. And they say that you can't, I know this sounds really abstract, but like without generating these kind of supportive conditions of generation of merit, that you won't be able to reveal your inner wisdom. And that could be its own like hour-long discussion, and I don't have time to further explain that, so I'm sorry if that just sounds abstract to you. I feel like it might be feeling a little abstract for some people, but I just have to leave it at that. So anyway, you are making this mandala offering. Think about it this way too. All right. When you habituate yourself to giving, the opposite of giving is grasping on one level. And one way that you are going to be able to realize the ultimate view, one way is by learning what it is. Another way, this is going to sound kind of far out, the view of ultimate reality is beyond anything you could think of it. So the more powerful you're grasping at wanting something to be something or wanting to hold on to something, grasping or fixation is contrary to being in the view. I know that sounds far out maybe right now, but the more you counter your grasping, the more your openness to giving and not holding is, the closer you already are to being in the nature of reality. So that's another side of it. Okay, so I'm going to move on from there. So anyway, in the mandala offering, you have some kind of little ritual kind of pan, and often they have you take some grains of rice or whatever and make these kind of piles, and you say a kind of offering prayer. And these piles are generally kind of representing different things. So on one level, they represent the entire outer world, like you're offering the entire world. In the Namchak mandala offering, the second level is that you offer your body and your whole kind of inner experience. And on the third level, you offer the very nature of your mind. So basically, it's like getting you to a point where you're not holding on to anything anymore. And that spot right there maybe is a gateway or an entryway into reality itself, even though it just seems like a giving practice or you're imagining giving things. But on another level, it's another way of kind of getting you into that view. Next point, the last practice is Guru Yoga. And so I guess I'll just say one little word about, in some practices at this point, they include, like, for example, in the Longqing Yingtik, sorry, that's just more Tibetan gibberish, but it's another name of a lineage. There's another set of preliminary practices for that sublineage. And in that one, at this point, there's a practice of something called chud, which means cutting. And so that is a practice where essentially you imagine, it's a practice of essentially imagining you give your body, but it's not what you might think. Like, that sounds kind of like masochistic or something. It's like you imagine that you're pure, like your Buddha nature, imagine your Buddha nature leaves your body and becomes a divine form. And then at that point, your body's just flesh and blood. You're not attached to it anymore. So you make it as an offering. The next practice is what's called Guru Yoga. And so in the Guru Yoga practice, essentially what you're doing is trying to connect to, one way of talking about it is trying to connect to your own Buddha nature through trying to see someone else's Buddha nature. And the easiest way for someone to see someone else's Buddha nature for most people is to see that in a being who's more kind of maybe spiritually developed than themselves. So that's where there is this like guru principle in Tantric Buddhism. Like, you work with a teacher closely. And in this practice, one of the main practices of this is kind of imagining your teacher there. You know, you imagine that the image in most of these practices is some kind of, you know, we have pictures of different kinds of Buddhas, and you imagine your teacher in that form. So in essence, you're imagining your teacher, but the form that they take is the form of this kind of Buddha. So you're kind of imagining them in this idealized form of full enlightenment. And the reason why we do that is because it's hard for us to see another person as an enlightened being, because we just want to think, oh, he's just another guy. He eats food and he goes to the bathroom and he takes showers and he sweats and whatever, you know. It's hard to relate to them as a fully enlightened being. So we imagine them in this kind of divine form. And then there's a practice of kind of requesting, you could say, like almost requesting them to help you access your own enlightenment, something like that. And then there's a kind of a visualization that like lights come from them and purify you, and then they dissolve into you, and then you and their enlightened mind and your mind become one, and then you just meditate like that. And in that practice, generally, there's a lot of mantra recitation. So in the Vajrasattva practice also, there's a lot of mantra recitation. So for each one of these practices, there are a lot of things you have to do. You don't just meditate on them for a couple days or a couple weeks or whatever. For example, I'm going to wrap back around to say like what you do for each one, because we're short on time already. So in the first one, the refuge practice, generally you recite a prayer 100,000 times, the refuge prayer, and you do 100,000 prostrations. So you do some kind of like, depending on your teacher, you either just like bend down, like I'll just show you, like this, onto your knees. Or you might do a fully outstretched prostration where your body's fully laid out on the ground 100,000 times. And for those of you who are not, who this is totally new to you, that might sound crazy and impossible. It's not at all. People do it all the time. It's a lot of exercise, and it, you know, gets your abs going pretty good, but it's definitely doable, very doable. The second one, in the bodhicitta practice, you recite the prayer a certain number of times. In some traditions, it's 100,000. In Namchak, sometimes they'll tell you 40,000. Sometimes they'll tell you 60,000. It depends on your teacher and what they ate for lunch that day or something. I don't know. Maybe it just depends on you. They might see you and they might think, oh, this person's really diligent and they're already really advanced. I'll make them do it 40,000 times. And then for the Vajrasattva practice, there are some different ones. Like there's a 100-syllable Vajrasattva mantra. There's a 6-syllable Vajrasattva mantra. So for the 100,000 syllable Vajra mantra, usually people will do that 100,000 times. For the 6-syllable mantra, sometimes they'll have you do it 600,000 or 700,000 times. For the mandala offering, you do this kind of little, like I said, there's like a little kind of pan of sorts, and you do this grain thing and you recite a prayer. Anyway, you do that 100,000 times. And then for the Guru Yoga practice in the Nyingma traditions, then they'll have you do the Guru Rinpoche mantra, Om Ahom Benza Guru Pema Siddhi Hong. It depends on your teacher. You know, for some teachers and in some circumstances, just to give people some encouragement to finish, they'll just have them do it 100,000 times, but generally it's 1.2 million times. So it's like 12 100,000s. And it depends on your teacher. Like my teacher in India, he told me that like you finish the first, all the practices, you keep doing Guru Yoga for a long time. Like you don't have to finish it right away. You can receive other higher teachings after that these were the preliminaries for. Some teachers want you to finish all of it before you can move on to the next step. So it just depends on your teacher. So anyway, let me come around to why you would want to even do these practices. Like what kind of person would want to do these practices? And we can talk about this a little bit after the discussion too. And yeah, it seems it took me an hour just to talk about what the practices are. So I had so many more things I wanted to talk about. All right. Anyway, I would say that first of all, don't do these practices if you just want to feel better about yourself. It's hard. They will feel good after you get into them, after you get into the flow. In the beginning, it's just hard. The person who would want to do these kind of practices is a person who has already kind of decided that Buddhism is for you, that you believe in this idea of enlightenment, and that you actually want to attain that, and not just for yourself, but for others as well. And you don't have to have 100% decided all of that, but if you're pretty sure, if your mind is like going in that direction, then you could start. But if you're not even in that direction, I'm just going to say flat out, this is not the path for you, at least not right now. And so these are practices which are, this might take this practice of the preliminaries might take you, if you're really hardcore and diligent and you do some retreats, it might take you 6 months. If you're doing it as a daily practice while you have a job, it might take you a few years, but it's not something to get out of the way. It's really profound practice that you can keep doing for years and years and years. And like I said before, the words at the beginning are really intense. They're really profound. And at the beginning, you might not really understand them, but as you practice more and more and more and more and more, those words become more and more meaningful. The practice becomes even more profound because you start to go deeper into the teachings, understand the words more, gain experiences of what they mean, and so forth. So one more thing is, I guess I need to talk about, we might just have to go over by like 10 minutes or something, if that's okay. If you wanted to do these practices and you wanted to figure out how and where and when to do them, through our Buddhist organizations, there are a couple ways you could do that. So one way is that through the Namchak Foundation, we have a program that's called Walking the Path. And that program is essentially a two-year program of calm abiding and profound insight, or Shamata and Vipassana meditations. And Ken Rinpoche really wants people to do that practice for 2 years and then do the preliminary practices, or you can kind of start the preliminary practices after the first year of that, because without some meditative stabilization and without some insight into the nature of emptiness and a little bit into the nature of your mind, then these practices become kind of just mental gymnastics. It's really important to, first of all, have some stabilization before you start trying to visualize all these stuff and all these mantras. It just becomes distraction. Second of all, it just becomes like a game of thinking, oh, there's this real Buddha over there, and it's really going to purify me, and no understanding of like a interdependent, nature of reality, which you gain through the practices of Vipassana. So if you wanted to do that through the Namchak Foundation, that's the kind of path that you would take. Is like, for example, like next spring, we'll have a new cohort of the Walking the Path program starting in April, or maybe end of March. We're going to have those dates up by end of October. And so you could progress in that way. The other way is if you've already done a lot of other stuff and you already kind of have your own kind of world of Buddhism, but you just want to receive the preliminaries. It's not super consistent, but almost every summer, if you check the awam.org website, it's not their schedule for next year is not listed at all. But almost every summer, Namchak Khen Rinpoche gives the Ngöndro preliminary teachings for like a week of teachings, or sometimes even 2 full weeks of teachings, which you could attend in person or online. And so those are two kind of ways that you could approach that through our neck of the woods. So AWAM and Namchak Foundation are like sister organizations. We have the same teachers, the same world. It's just different administration and so forth. So either way, if you If you received the preliminaries through AWAM, it would be Namchak Khenpo with me translating. If you received them through Namchak, it would be Namchak Khenpo with me translating. So either way, it's just going to be that if you did it through Namchak, there's a little bit more of a support network in that AWAM is like you just go and then you leave and then you do the practices and then try and check in from time to time on your own. With the Namchak Foundation, we have like these kind of learning circles where people check in with each other. We have more of a structured way for you to check in with the teachers. There's a little bit more support. So that's just up to you if you were interested in trying to do that. I'm going to look at my notes real quick because there were 2 or 3 things that I was like, you have to talk about this. And I already talked about those things. All right, that's great. So the main points, once again, let me just sum up, is that if you were to do these practices, this is what Ken Rinpoche always says, that if you want to gauge your success, let's say some of you might already be doing these practices and you just came for some more context or you're just interested. What does this guy have to say about it? And, and you know, he always says that as you're practicing, is your wish, your determination to be free, is your wish for liberation getting stronger? If it's not, you need to put some more effort into the 4 thoughts. Is your wish to free all other beings from suffering and bring them to enlightenment getting stronger? Is your bodhicitta getting stronger? If not, maybe your practice of bodhicitta is becoming just words. You need to like do a little bit more of the mind training practices. And then lastly, pure view. And so pure view has to do with both sides of, in one context, starting to see your cup as pure. On another level, starting to see your teacher through Guru Yoga as a fully enlightened being. On another level, starting to have more pure perception of all of your own thoughts, of all the beings and other people around you. Are you starting to be, you know, less judgmental, starting to maybe see through the veil of your own kind of judgment? And if not, then there's some corrections to be made in your practice, and maybe your practice of the preliminaries isn't quite hitting the mark and you should talk to your teacher about it. So those are the 3 main kind of like guideposts for preliminary practices are your renunciation or wish to be free, bodhicitta, and pure view. And those are the 3 things that you're really trying to develop through this.